Number 1. Country Road. Driving was a pretty big deal to me growing up. I couldn't wait to learn how. When I was 13, my uncle decided to teach me how to drive. This really wasn't too unusual. My dad actually learned to drive when he was younger than me. Living out in the country, I don't know. Maybe there wasn't a whole lot else to do but drive and teach people how to drive. But honestly, I think the reason so many of us were looking forward to learning how to drive, and then learned how to drive at such a young age, was because of the geography of the area that we grew up in. Driving was necessary. Everyone lived so far apart that if you didn't drive, or at least knew someone who did drive, you couldn't spend so much time with other people. And we were a long way from having internet, and even cable wasn't too common in that area. I remember my second cousins actually had one of those old satellite dishes. One of the really big ones that moved slowly whenever you changed the channel. So I was 13 when I learned. And once I learned how to drive, I was allowed to drive around for the most part. I didn't get my license until I was older. But that wasn't a big deal either. Even the police in town wouldn't pull you over if they knew you didn't have a license. That is just how common it was for anyone to drive at a young age, or even at an older age, but without a license. So when I was 15, I had a really scary experience. My dad had to catch a bus to go to a funeral of a friend who lived out of state. He didn't want to leave the pickup truck at the stop, so he had me drive him to the bus stop. I was then to take the truck home. So I was driving home, and was going through the town, heading toward the road that would take me home. I stopped at a four-way stop. There was already a car sitting perpendicular to me. A young man was sitting in the driver's seat. There was an older guy in the passenger seat as well, and a third guy sitting right behind him in the back of the car. The guy driving looked really nervous for some reason. I couldn't really tell you what I saw in his eyes, but he was obviously very uncomfortable. He had the right-of-way, but he hadn't gone yet. He was just sitting there. He looked at me, then at the road, then at me again, and then the road again. Finally, the guy sitting behind him nudged the driver's seat pretty roughly. Immediately after he did, the guy pulled into the intersection. He went straight. He glanced at me a few times as he drove on. I still don't know completely why I did it, but I decided to wait a moment after the car had driven forward. I was also going forward, which was a different direction than the car was going. However, in the middle of the intersection, I changed my mind. I turned and began going the direction that the car was going. It was the look in the guy's eyes that bothered me the most. It was a very desperate look. That's the only way I could describe it. Plus, I guess, with how quickly he reacted when the guy behind him had nudged the back of the chair. They hadn't gotten far ahead of me, but I also tried not to get too close to them. If something negative was going on, I didn't want to endanger the driver or anything. Because if something bad was going on, he was obviously going to be the victim of it. The car drove out of town, and I followed it. After following it for a bit, the car made a turn onto a dirt road. I was still not too far behind it, so I drove out in that direction as well. And I followed it as I went on. The car drove down off of a hill and further out into the country. It turned off more than once onto other country roads, and I kept following it. So it is probably obvious to you listening to this what I was doing wrong. I was only 15 years old, and this was a long time ago, so I didn't realize it myself. but I was completely making it obvious to everyone in the car that I was following them. But I wasn't thinking, and I hadn't watched a lot of movies where it was obvious that someone was being tailed. So I didn't think that anyone really would have caught on. We drove really far out. But I never thought about ceasing following the car because I was worried about the driver. Now, we were traveling in one direction. That road continued straight, but there was a turn onto another dirt road that went up into a hill. The turn was nearly a complete 180-degree turn. The car turned and began going up the hill, and then I turned and began following it. We didn't get very far up the hill before the car stopped. And of course, I had to stop with it. The road going up the hill was even narrower than the one we had taken in the first place. There was no way I could drive around the car without falling off the side of the hill. The driver's side back door opened and someone got out. I noticed that whoever it was had something in his hand, and he was walking right toward my truck. With my lights on, it was hard to see what the guy was carrying, but I figured it was a weapon. Not knowing what to do at first, I took my foot off the brake, and the pickup lurched forward a bit. The man recoiled, and I put my foot back on the brake. Remember, the road was narrow, so I couldn't jump out of the way. I revved the engine a little, realizing that I had intimidated him a little bit. After a moment, the guy in the passenger front seat got out of the car too, and he had something in his hand. I could tell it was a tire iron. He began walking toward me. I was happy to see that it was a tire iron. Remember, I was a country boy who was driving a pickup truck without a license. That wasn't the only illegal thing I was doing. I put on the brake, and I reached behind the seat of the truck. My dad always kept his loaded shotgun behind the seat. I grabbed it and a few shells. Putting the shells in my pocket, I opened the door to the truck. Both guys stopped. I'm not sure if they were able to tell what I had in my hand, but when I pointed it at them, they got the general idea, and they froze. And that is when the unexpected happened. The car took off down the road. At first, one of the guys turned and went to go after them, but I yelled at them to stop. They did, and I made them throw down their tire irons. When the car was gone, I slowly got back into my truck. I backed down the road, intending to get back down. When I did, I saw the car coming back down toward me. He must have gone up and found a spot to turn around in. I made room for him, and I let him pass me back on the dirt road we drove in on. I then followed the guy out of the road, leaving the two guys stranded on the side of the hill. I followed the guy back into town. He stopped at the sheriff's station and got out of the car. We both went in and talked to the sheriff about what had happened. The victim hadn't known the guys. They were hiding in his car while he was working at the grocery store. He got into his car after work without checking it. They were forcing him to drive out to that hill, not knowing why he was being taken there. When he had seen me, he had been hoping that his look of distress was conveyed to me, and thankfully it had been. Fully. I couldn't describe the guys, but the sheriff didn't need my description. They got caught and went to jail. Number 2. A walk. The area and the era that I grew up in is a whole lot different than things in my life are today. I grew up in Monroe County, Ohio. The closest town to where I lived was a place called Louisville. I, in fact, just looked it up before I began writing this down. I haven't been back there in a very long time, and I was just curious about it. At the last census, the village of Louisville had a population of 176 people. It's weird, because it seemed so much bigger when I was growing up there. I was an only child. Furthermore, we lived out in an unpopulated part of the county. Actually, I guess with Monroe County, that could be any part of it. Well, I really liked hearing and telling scary stories growing up. But of course, enjoying that sort of thing always made me scared when I was home by myself. And although it didn't happen a lot, it did happen more often during the summertime. My dad drank a lot, and he would get together with his cousins or siblings, and they would drink way into the night. But anyway, our house was like an hour away from the town, and we didn't have air conditioning or anything like that. And it would often get much hotter in the house than it would be outside. When I was 13, I remained home when my parents went to visit relatives. I enjoyed the time by myself, and they didn't mind. This night was really, really hot, and the house was unbearable. So I decided I was going to go out for a walk to see if the air outside was any cooler. It was, so I ended up going for quite a walk. I knew I wouldn't be getting much sleep, and I knew that my parents would not be back anytime soon, so I just had no plan on how long I would be out. The houses were few and far between on this road. They were so far apart, and most were only old trailers that older people lived in or were abandoned. So I didn't expect to run into anyone or to see anyone. The night was clear. I remember that. And I was a bit far away from home. I was walking by a field of crops and just was deep in thought. And that was when I heard it. I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from out in the field. I had heard screams in horror movies, but this was different. This was a scream, real terror and real fear. And I stopped, terrified myself. Almost immediately, it was followed by another scream, and then another, and another. Each one was just completely awful, and all I could do was stand there, looking out over the huge field, wondering where the scream had come from. There may have been 6 or 7 screams altogether, and then it was quiet, and I just stood there, wondering what had just happened. I didn't know what to do either. I just kept looking out over the field, trying to tell where the scream had come from. And that's when I saw, from a distance, a figure stand up in the middle of the field. It was as if he had been kneeling, or something, and had just risen up. I had no idea if he had seen me or not, but I didn't wait to find out. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back toward my house. My running was making a lot of noise on the gravel, but that was the least of my concerns. If someone had been getting murdered or something, I didn't want to be the next victim. By the time I got back to my house, I was exhausted. But I didn't slow down. I ran into the house and locked the door. And then I was terrified of being in the house. I hadn't locked it when I left. We just didn't live in a place where you had to do that. So then, I had to check out the entire house in order to feel like I was safe. I spent the rest of the night in the corner of my room. I waited for my parents to get home before going to bed. I explained to them what happened. That was a mistake because my dad was very drunk. He grabbed his rifle and got back into the car and drove off. He drunkenly decided he was going to find whoever it was that was causing that person to scream. My dad was gone for like 2 hours, and it was terrifying the entire time. We didn't know what to think. We wondered if he had gotten killed or something, especially because at one point we heard gunshots in the distance. This was not abnormal for our area though. That night, it just terrified us more. And my dad finally got back. Rather than tell us what had happened, he passed out in his chair. He didn't remember anything about the search in the morning. None of us ever found out what had happened that night. Number 3. Hike. This isn't a very long story, but I will do my best to get to the point as quickly as possible. It happened a long time ago, though, back in the 70s. I like the wilderness quite a bit. I like to go camping and hiking every time that I get a chance to do so. My friend Jim, who I'd known all of my life, loves it too. We go camping and hiking several times a year. Each time we always try to find a new place to explore. And when we were 25 years old, we had the freakiest experience of our life. I have to admit that we don't always hike in places that we were allowed to, and this was one of those times. So because of that, I guess I shouldn't mention where it happened. Anyhow, this was going to be a pretty long hiking trip. We got in contact with some other people who had hiked the area before. That way, we were able to get some idea of where we were going. Also, we never really got lost. It was absolutely a lot easier to get lost back then than it is nowadays. Jim has a talent that is pretty useful for going on hiking trips in non-hiking areas. He is pretty good at mapping out where we go, which makes it easy enough for us to find our way back pretty easily. So on this particular trip, we were going to be out hiking for about 2 weeks. I'll tell you one thing about where we were hiking. It was so large that even with 2 weeks of hiking, there is no way we would be able to explore the entire area. But that's cool. That just made the whole thing seem much more fun in my view. We'd been out for about 5 days, and something really disturbing happened. We had set up our camp for the night. Jim was looking around for firewood. As I was trying to get some other things situated, Jim came up to me. He looked really freaked out. When I asked him what was wrong, he told me he had to show me something. I then followed Jim, and he led me toward a creek. My first thought was why he didn't suggest that we move our camp down to the creek. But that didn't matter when he led me over to a tree, and I was shocked at what was there. A severed human hand was nailed to the tree, and I'm not an expert on how quickly a severed limb would decay, but it didn't look like it had been done a very long time ago. It was missing a thumb, and 2 nails had been driven through its palm, attaching it to the tree. Obviously, we both had reason to panic, and we did. It was getting closer to sundown, and we were in the middle of nowhere at that point, and there might be some homicidal person out there. Anyone crazy enough to chop off someone's hand and then nail it to a tree was certainly crazy enough to hurt 2 young hikers in the middle of the night. We didn't really have much that we could do, though, other than continue our trip. We were not quite halfway through it, but pretty close. Getting out of the woods was not going to be something that we would be able to do very fast. I have heard some stories that are similar to ours, where people are hiking and they find or see something scary, and then they hurry to do their best to get out of the woods. But hurrying through the wilderness is never a good idea to begin with. It's a good way to get lost or injured. We went ahead and went back to our camp. All we could really do was try and be aware of what was going on around us. The first night, after finding the hand, had to be the scariest. The whole thing was so fresh in our brains, but we didn't hear anything, and we hadn't seen any other indication that anyone else was around. The following day, we started back the way that we had come from. Having traveled the path toward the area that we had found the hand in, it was comforting to see the familiar area on the way back. We slept a little bit sounder that night, but we were still on edge the entire time. When day came, it was always a bit of a relief. Even though the wilderness can be scary at both the day and the night, it was obviously less during the day. After a couple days, we really weren't worried at all anymore. It seemed much less likely that we would run into anybody if we hadn't by then. We eventually made it out of the woods. We called rangers in the area. We had to admit that we were trespassing, but we had to let them know what we had found. Jim provided his map to them. One of the rangers asked us why we hadn't taken the hand down off the tree. I didn't feel like I really needed to answer that. Who wants to pull a nailed hand off a tree? But that's the story. Maybe not terrifying, but I'm sure no one wants it to happen to them. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.